are the values and ideas that this holiday of Purim is trying to teach us? And how does it try to communicate that through the heroes and villains of the story? Now, more than any other of our holidays, there is a very detailed portrayal of the heroes and the villains of the story, more than the average, the other stories that we have. There's an event that in many ways carries the holiday and carries the value system that it attempts to portray. The holiday of Purim uses a story with great care to articulate a number of ideas. The first thing that it does is that it gives Judaism its first villain, first major villain, much more than Pharaoh, than Paro, who is a partial villain, but at the end of the day, even gets stuck in a role which God forces upon him to enable God to do what God wants to do in the story. Haman is right. Thank you. As if we pick up and we start in chapter 3 on page 1789, one of the first things we learn about Haman at the beginning of chapter 3 is that this is an individual whom Achashverosh promotes. What we learn about him is that he makes a very interesting move. When Mordechai refuses to bow down to Haman, he doesn't become a hater of Mordechai. He becomes a hater of the Jewish people as a whole. When Haman, on verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone. Having been told who Mordechai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people, throughout the kingdom of Achashverosh. And in many ways, the paradigm of anti-Semitic policy throughout history, or any racist policy, is you find one individual and you say, here, there's one person. This is a person who I have an agenda with. My issue is not with this person. My issue is with all Palestinians, all Israelis, all blacks, in other words, that move of going from the individual and generalizing it becomes a critical tool for the proliferation of evil and pain in the world. And Haman, as the paradigm, or as this paradigm evil villain, his first move is as somebody who is personally affronted. Now, it might be legitimate for him to be personally affronted by Mordechai. The move that he makes is to say that my battle is not with Mordechai alone, but I have an agenda. I now want to destroy a people in total. Now, after he makes that move, something very interesting happens. He doesn't have the power to destroy the Jewish people. Who has that power? All power is centralized in the hands of Achashverosh. Now, he turns to Achashverosh and says as follows. Haman said to Achashverosh, there is a certain people scattered, on verse 8, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed amongst the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury. Thereupon the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata the Gadadi, the foe of the Jews. And the king said, the money and the people are yours to do with as you see fit. Achashverosh enters the story. Now, one of the interesting moves that is made here is that Haman turns to Achashverosh and says, I want to destroy whom? Who does Haman ask Achashverosh to destroy? and anonymous people. He doesn't say, listen, there's the Jews, there's the people, let me point them out to you. Ahasuerus is portrayed here as a king who his assistant comes to him and says to him, I'd like to destroy a people. And how does Ahasuerus respond to this call to destroy a people? Okay. He doesn't say, who are they? What is the problem? What is the difficulty? We have this evil person who uses, or who his personal, the personal insult that he experienced is used as a vehicle to create or to spread his hatred and his anger, and ultimately his venom and his desire to destroy to a total people, going from one to the total. And that move is a very, very important move to remember, because it's a paradigm move in which it's the way in which evil is very often spread. And then he goes to the person. There is a check and balance. Mordechai is not the one in control. The one in control, just one second please, is Ahasuerus. He goes to Ahasuerus, but Ahasuerus doesn't play any role as check and balance. He doesn't even want to know who these people are. There is a people who, they're different. They don't listen. They don't do what other people do. They don't listen to you. He doesn't check at all. Ahasuerus is portrayed as a completely disconnected leader from the people. He has all the power. He's the one who's responsible for the people. But he's portrayed as, you want to kill a people? Okay, I have a lot of people. You want to kill them? Go kill a people. It's okay to kill a people. Now, this is expressed even more powerfully at the end of this chapter. When the word goes out on verse 15, the couriers went out post-haste on the royal mission, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan. The king and Haman sat down to feast, and the city of Shushan was dumbfounded. Navocha was in chaos. What the author of this Megillah is trying to portray to us is the difference between Ahasuerus and Haman on the one hand, and everything that happens outside of the palace on the other. There is a distinction between life in the palace and life outside of the palace. Life in the palace, what does Haman and Ahasuerus do? They sit and you can't say this. They sit and sip champagne. Try doing that one. They sit and I can't even do it if I want to. They're drinking wine. And the rest of what happens in the city? The whole city is in chaos. Now, who is in chaos here? The text is very clear. It's not just the Jews. Now, why is everybody in chaos? Because if the king, who has all the power, could determine just like this, okay, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow, you could kill, there's a people here who all of you are allowed to destroy. Do you know how up till now there's a system of order, there's a system of laws. People don't harm each other. The job of the king is to reinforce or to enforce a system of peaceful negotiations and relationships between people, between the various 27 kingdoms and peoples who live in his domain. The king is breaking the rule. And the king breaks the rule without any reflection, without any investigation, without any second opinion. The king doesn't even want to know the name of the people. The paradigm of the king is someone completely disconnected from everybody outside of his palace. When the person who has all the power is completely disconnected from the people whom he governs, there is no limit to what he will do. He can destroy a people without even knowing who they are, and he will sit and have kiddush while the people are suffering. And the gap between him and the people is the first, I would say, lesson that this story wants to teach us as it begins to introduce the personality of Mordechai. The villain is the one who does evil, is capable of doing evil, but the particular villain that is being portrayed to us is someone who is completely disassociated from those around him. This is a story of the haves and the have-nots. If you are in the palace, you live one life. If you are outside of the palace, you live another life. And those inside the palace are completely disconnected from those outside of the palace. Now, the big challenge that we're about to face is that we Jews put somebody in the palace, right? We put Esther into the palace. And now we're going to go down and see what is the personality of Mordechai and what is the personality of Esther. Very briefly, yes, please.
I completely agree with your characterization of Haman, but it seems to me that Mordecai makes the first move to say it's not just a problem between you and me. And, you know, in verse 4, when they spoke to him day after day in chapter 3, he did not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's involved with him.
Right.
Or he had explained to them that he was a Jew.
Right.
He's the first one who says, you actually have a problem with the Jews.
Right. That's okay. Interesting. Now, he does. You're absolutely right. He does use his Judaism. Now, whether a Jew, in fact, could bow down or not, you know, in fact, a Jew, you know, so the rabbinic tradition has trouble with that, and they, you know, because a Jew should be, you know, we are required to show respect to political leadership. So, what was exactly Mordechai's problem here? What was he doing? We don't really know. But you are right, he did instigate the beginning of the fight. But did he think that this fight would therefore then be, you know, would get out of control in that matter is a separate question. Yes, sir.
I again completely agree with you.
Both of you, by the way, have the beginning of your comments were very, very deep and profound.
Now I lose it. There's another parallel to the story that's going on, which I think is the Joseph story. And this is our
What I need to do is right now, in the middle, when I stop, then we'll have extra. We can now do much shorter comments. The parallels will take much longer. If you can hold to when my class is over.
But in terms of sitting down to lunch.
The sitting down to lunch.
Right. Is the first hint of that parallel, because the brothers sat down to lunch after they put Joseph in the
After they put Joseph in the Okay, interesting. They did that similar move. Got you.
Then the parallel
will continue throughout. Very good. Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Part of, we wonder if part of Mordecai's chutzpah at not wanting to bow down had to do with the fact that Esther was the ace in the hole in the palace and gave him permission to now say, we're going to take on something that we haven't been able to take on before.
We don't know. It's a very good question. Why does Mordechai allow himself to do this? And how does he function? We really don't know. There is something wrong in Mordechai's behavior. Jews, we don't pick fights with kings. In the diaspora, we give the kings our daughters. We don't we don't pick fights with them. You know, it's a very strange personality. I'm not getting into that part of the story because on the one hand, he gives them his niece. So, you know, what great piety are you showing there? And then now you're not bowing down to a it's an unknown. I don't know fully. Whenever I don't feel that the text carries enough, I just sort of leave it as a question. In other words, I don't know why he's picking this fight. Under Jewish law, he doesn't have to pick this fight. It's not necessary. Does he feel... What? The Honor Society lecture last night, right. So he doesn't have to pick that fight. He could have participated. But does he think that he's privileged? Does he think that Esther is his ace up the hole to save him whenever he needs to? Those are questions that I don't know. Or maybe we don't know. It could very well be. It could be that he's just uncivil. Whatever it is, Mordechai does what he does. But Mordechai's actions become the beginning of this great danger facing the Jewish people, precisely because of the particular move that Haman makes, but more significantly, the type of person that King Ahasuerus is. If King Ahasuerus, what do you mean kill one of my people? What do I want? You want to kill all the Jews because Mordechai didn't bow down to you? This is crazy. The insanity of this story is only possible when there is such a dramatic gap between those in the palace and those outside of the palace. And now what happens as we begin? Now I want to spend a little more time now looking at these next verses here. And Mordechai learned all that had happened. Mordechai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city crying out loudly and bitterly until he came in front of the palace gate, for one could not enter the palace gate wearing a sackcloth. We'll start with the end. Just as the king and Mordechai and Haman sit down to drink while the whole city and all of society is in turmoil, what is it we learn about the palace? You can't go into the palace with what? With reality. You can't go into the palace with your stuff, with your mourning, with your suffering. In other words, there's a world, you have pain, there's something going on outside. It's not an accident that we're sitting and drinking. That's not an accident. We don't know. What happens outside is not allowed to enter into the palace. It's not just the callousness of Achashverosh. There's an institution called the palace in which the problems of the world aren't allowed to go in there. You're not allowed to bring your sackcloth. What does Mordechai do? Now this person who was privileged, the first thing that he does when he hears that the Jews are in danger, now he could feel guilty, what did I do? That's part of it. But there's a very specific mode of action that he embarks on. First, he learns what happened. Mordechai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. The first thing Mordechai does when you encounter a catastrophe is you radically change your lifestyle. You don't deal with a catastrophe. One of the biggest problems we face is that very often we are confronted with huge challenges, and we try to deal with these challenges in the midst of our everyday life. It's like, okay, I'm going to work, I'm going to do this, and from 5:30 to 5:45, I'm really going to work on the Darfur issue. No, it's going to be quality time. It's going to be quality time. There is a sense whereby we continue, one of our big problems is that we continue to live our everyday lives, and in the midst of our everyday lives, we try to deal with various issues. Mordechai says no. There is a problem, life stops. Regular life ceases for Mordechai the minute the problem is encountered. He doesn't say tomorrow, and the transformation is complete. Complete. He changes his appearance. And this is a long-standing Jewish tradition of, should I rip Kriya? If I don't feel it, should I do it? The principle is act in such a way that you want to feel. In other words, behavior doesn't have to reflect your feelings. Doesn't have to reflect your feelings. You behave in a certain way so that your feelings will be of a certain type. It's a reverse. It's not a search constantly for authentic behavior reflecting feelings, but when catastrophe happens, you act in catastrophe mode. Catastrophe mode is tearing your clothing, putting on sackcloth and ashes. You enter into mourning mode. Mordechai's life is transformed. And he goes to the place that could make a difference. And he realizes that it's up to him. Now Mordechai, it's at least plausible that Mordechai could have tried to save himself. He did have Esther in place. It's at least plausible that he could have tried. Mordechai assumes immediately complete and total responsibility for the destiny of the Jewish people. Our hero is a person who, when he hears that the Jewish people are in danger, gets up and says, Hineni, I'm here. Stops completely his regular behavior, transforms his life to act, and walks to the one place that he knows could make a difference. The one problem is he can't get in there. In other words, what his response in the marketplace is precisely that which doesn't let him get into the palace. In other words, Mordechai is the antithesis of the palace person. The problem is that the power is in the palace. He is embodying the crisis. He says life can't continue. What do? I have to get to the palace. The problem is, since he's carrying all of this on him, he can't get to the palace. So he stops at the gate. What does he then do? The Jewish people as well are also mourning, etc., and they're weeping. Now, when Esther, on verse 4, here comes one of the more interesting sections of the whole Megillah. When Esther's maiden and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. Now, this is a great literary device. Of course she's going to be agitated. Why? You see, you already know the answer. You would think that why is she greatly agitated? She would be greatly agitated that the Jews are being destroyed. You think here, the eunuchs come, what is it that they tell Esther? We don't know. We have Esther, the princess, sitting in the palace. Mordechai comes. The eunuchs tell her that Mordechai's there. She gets greatly upset. You'd think that her being very upset is, I'm upset at what's happening to the Jews. Quite to the contrary. She sent clothing for Mordechai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. She wants Mordechai to come into the palace. Because you can't bring your outside world. She knows the rules of the palace. Now, when Mordechai, thereupon Esther summoned, but he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hatach, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordechai to learn why and wherefore of it all. Now we discover what basically happened. Esther was in the palace. She didn't know what was happening to the Jewish people, because the palace is a place completely disconnected from reality. It's not simply you don't wear your sackcloth. Nothing enters into the king's world. And ultimately, he has a completely mediated world in accordance with whatever it is that he wants to hear, how he wants to hear it. The great challenge that Mordechai now faces is he put Esther in the palace, possibly to save the Jews. The problem is that Esther has become a palace person, no different than Achashverosh is. You send her there, she's living there, that's her world. Her immediate response when she sees Mordechai wasn't even to ask why. Her immediate response was, change your clothing. In other words, something happened to Esther here. You'd think that the first thing she would have said is, Mordechai, what's going on? She only asks what's going on after Mordechai refuses to change his clothing. She basically says, whatever is happening to you outside is not my concern. Let me dress you up so that you can come into my world. But Mordechai is the personification of the person who says, you don't stay in the palace in order to disconnect from the world. The palace is the responsibility, is a responsibility and an opportunity to shape what happens outside of the world. But for Esther, the palace has become an escape from the world. She is like Achashverosh. There is no outside world. And Mordechai now has the very difficult task of how do I make Esther a Jew again? I sent her there to be my spy. She grew up there. But now she's not one of me anymore. But I need her to save the Jewish people. But the problem is, she doesn't seem to care anymore. Hatach went out to Mordechai in the city square in front of the place, and Mordechai told him all that had happened to him, and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the written text for the law, for the law had been proclaimed in Shushan for their destruction. He bade him show it to Esther, and inform her and charge her to go to the king, to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. God bless you. So here it is. Okay. Mordechai hears. Mordechai responds. This is a moment in Jewish history which we prepare for all the time. It's basically AIPAC ideology. We want people in place. We are a people who are dependent on other forces. We can't always fight on our own. We need an asset in place. Mordechai gets the information to the asset in place, Esther. And what's the problem? He says the Jewish people are about to be destroyed, and her answer is more or less, it's dangerous. I'm scared. All the kings, Esther told Hathach to take back to Mordechai the following reply. All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's province know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Which is again very consistent. There's a very consistent portrayal of King Ahasuerus. You don't come to the king unless I call you. It's like, you don't set my agenda. I mediate my world. I mediate my world. And he himself, you have to realize, like afterwards, when he comes to, he officially declares Mordechai the Jew. On the one hand, he gives an edict to destroy the Jews, and then he declares that Mordechai the Jew should be elevated. He doesn't even know that there's a contradiction, because he doesn't even know that he has an edict to destroy the Jews. He's not, in other words, he is, this sense of evil as such deep indifference, that the personification of evil is when people's problems can't enter your domain. You remember we studied last year that notion of, are you allowed to build a gate on your house? Like if the poor people, that the person who builds this gate, this outside fence beyond their door, Elijah doesn't visit them. Like, up to a certain date, Elijah visited you. You build the gate, Elijah stops visiting you because the outside world doesn't have access. And the idea is that if you want to have a gate, that's fine, but it has to be something that the outside world could open. If you have a gate with locks that no one could get to you, if you have means, and you created a reality where those who need you don't have access to you, that is the beginning of creating an evil, corrupt society. And this is basically the personification of Ahasuerus. And Esther says, I can't bring you, I can get you into the palace as long as you change your clothing. But you don't get to bring your tsaris, your story, to the king. But her response is, it's dangerous. Now, this is you don't want to judge Esther too negatively, because she was basically left alone in this world. But this is not the response that you hope for. You're hoping for a response when someone says, go to the king, the Jewish people as a whole are about to be destroyed. Her answer should be, Hineni, I'm here. Her answer shouldn't be, oh, it might be dangerous for me. There's something missing in her response. She doesn't have that sense of responsibility. She doesn't have that sense of Mordechai that all of life has to stop when you encounter tragedy, when you encounter evil. Everything must stop until you meet it. It's dangerous. And then Mordechai has to engage in a very, very difficult attempt to try to convert her. And if you look at this story of him trying to convert her, when Mordechai was told what Esther had said, Mordechai had this message delivered to Esther. Now, it's very interesting. Mordechai never goes into the castle. And the story is trying to... In other words, Mordechai never leaves his connection to reality, because that's what Mordechai is. Mordechai is the person grounded in reality. He's grounded there. He's grounded in the problems of the people, and he never gets disconnected from them. And he says to her, do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Mordechai's response to Esther is really quite interesting. He both speaks to her noble side and her more base side. On the noble side, Mordechai gives his theory of election. The job of the elected, you are elected for moments like these. Elected is not a privilege which grants you status. Election is that which you receive in order to serve. You are here for this moment. And if you don't fulfill this moment, you are ultimately giving lie to saying, I'm in the palace, why do you think you're in the palace? Mordechai is trying, how do I break down the dichotomy between the palace and the real world? One is by saying the whole purpose of the palace is to serve life outside of the palace. It's not to create a counter-reality. You get into the palace precisely for these types of moments. The second thing he does, and this is the first answer, is he says the palace, you're living a life in which the palace is this independent, separate world. I want to tell you, you're not going to be in such a world. And it's like, is it an idle threat? Probably. But it's like, you know how in the Jewish tradition, we never like to appeal to people's good inclinations alone because we don't trust them? It's like, if you only appeal to someone's good inclinations, that might work, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with here. In other words, he sent his niece, but he's lost her. He left her alone. He left her, sent her there, as this asset in place for years. And now he doesn't know, how do I get Esther to be responsible again? So on the one level, he threatens her. Is it a fake threat? Probably, because she'll be just fine. She's nobody knows. Remember, Esther doesn't say that she's a Jew, and if Mordechai's not going to tell, she's going to be fine. So, but he does two things. On the one hand, he threatens her and says that your privilege will not protect you, because your whole foundation is to believe that my privilege makes me immune from the suffering of others. So the first is saying it won't. Whether true or not doesn't matter. But he doesn't just threaten. He also offers her a larger vision. And that is, I want you to see that being positioned in the palace is a task, a purpose, a responsibility, not a reward. There's a similar parallel debate, by the way, in how we look at chosenness of Israel. Whether being a chosen people is a system which declares the rewards that the Jew. In other words, when we are chosen, we're going to study this together. The story of Abraham, when the Jewish people are chosen in the Bible, we basically live our own history. We're immune to everyone else's history. Whatever happens to people outside doesn't happen to us. In other words, chosenness creates this sense of, could create this notion that I'm separate from the world and their story's not my story. Or chosenness could be some sense of responsibility, that I'm given something in order to become something. I'm going to finish in a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for all questions or dialogue. Then Esther says something very, very interesting. Esther understands. And Esther says to return, Esther sent back the answer to Mordechai. Go assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law, and if I am to perish, I shall perish. Esther turns around. Her core answer was beforehand, it's dangerous. She says, Kasher avadati avadati. Whatever happens to me, it's not about me. She understands that it's not about me. But she asks for something. She asks that the people fast. She asks that everybody fast, go assemble 3 days and observe the same fast. She doesn't say, by the way, what could she have said? Instead of fasting, she could have said, pray. She doesn't say, notice she doesn't say pray. And this is not an accident, because we're going to get to this in a moment. The whole world of God and prayer is completely absent from this story. It could be hinted. He said, maybe you were given this privilege for this moment. Is there a hint of God's role? There is no call upon God here. It's alien to the story. What is she asking for? She's saying basically, you, Mordechai, are saying to me that I shouldn't use the palace as the place which disconnects me from the reality, but the palace is the place which I use in order to serve the world. That privilege is a responsibility. She says it goes both ways. I'm in the palace. You want me to endanger my life? Do the people feel that I'm part of them? Does the person who's privileged, you want me to take responsibility? I'll take responsibility if there is some form of collective solidarity. You want to break down the barriers between the palace and outside of the palace? I'll break them down if the people outside of the palace feel me as a part of them. If they say, oh, I don't care about her. In other words, are we in this together? Is the palace truly not the dividing line? I come back to my people, but are my people coming back to me? Do my people have a sense of responsibility to me? I'll endanger my life if they know that my endangering my life is something important. And so this chapter comes to a conclusion. And I see chapter 4 as the central value chapter of this whole Megillat Esther. Because beforehand, chapter 1 and 2 is the setup of putting everybody in place. Chapter 3 is where the problem occurs. It's where Mordechai creates the conflict and the dramatic consequences of that conflict in a world in which those who are in the palace don't care about those who are outside of the palace, and all evil could take place. The transformation takes place in chapter 4. The remainder is just, once she's there, the story unfolds, and it's a pretty even boring story. It's like she goes and this and sends him once and sends him twice and comes and this and a lot of names, and it's like after this, the story sort of becomes, it's like it's on its roll. This is where it changes. It changes with a Mordechai being the personification of collective responsibility, and it ends with Esther buying into that same sense of responsibility on condition that we really are one people. When there is collective solidarity, then you have a people who look out for each other. In other words, Mordechai becomes the paradigm. Esther becomes the convert. The Jewish people accept the same criteria and that same sense of collective responsibility. Now, what this story is ultimately about? The story of Purim is the story of the Jewish people saving themselves in a times of dire need by each one of us recognizing our responsibility for the other. It's a story of collective solidarity, and through that collective solidarity, creating a people who's able to withstand the dangers of history. What is the ritual of Purim according to the story? Chapter 9. What is it that we are supposed to celebrate? Remember, on Pesach, we eat matzah and commemorate what? The Jewish people's, the fact that we're remembering the essence of that moment when the Jewish people ran and left. We offer the Passover lamb to remember the God who skipped over the homes and saved the Jewish people. The rituals key you to the core of the story. What is it that you do? What are the rituals of Purim? Not the rituals today. The rituals as understood by this book itself. Do you remember what they are? Exactly. Two things. The same day the Jews enjoined, this is on page, it's chapter 9, verse 22. Right. The same day on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which they had been transformed from them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy, they were to observe them as days, the Jews agreed, to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, an occasion of sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. There is no, after God drowns the Egyptians, what do? We begin singing a song. Az Yashir Moshe v'nei Sodenu, the Israel and Moses sing the song of praise to the Lord for saving us. We don't sing a song in this book to thank God for the salvation. We do two things to commemorate this salvation. Three. One is we have a holiday. It's a festival because we're celebrating our salvation. And then we have two rituals. Ritual number one is giving gifts to one another and gifts to the poor. This is the holiday of Purim. You don't create a community by just helping the poor. You don't just create solidarity by helping people in times of need. You actually create community by sharing festival moments with each other. It's not just the poor. You first have to create a community. Purim is the holiday of Jewish solidarity and collectivity. And that is why, what do? You send it to your friends. It's like I always have this thing that I always like on Purim to send shalach manos to somebody I had a fight with last year. Do you know how sometimes like you do something stupid and you don't know how to get out of it? You don't know how to begin. Like you don't know how to make the first call. It's like, oops, they called me. Or like it's sometimes like you don't do this because that's your job. It's like I've now made it. Sometimes you miss a shiva. You can't make it back again. It's like it sits there between you and this other person because you know you had to be there for them and you weren't. Like you missed it. It's like, I was tired. There's so many people. We have lists of reasons, It's like, I couldn't go. There's so many other people. They wouldn't have known if I was there in any event. And it's like, and it's there, and it's like this albatross sitting in the between you. It's like right there. You don't even know if they know it or not. But it's your see. It's like, you can't do it. Or like, sometimes maybe you were once at a dinner, and you made a joke. It's like, you thought you were funny. And it turns out you hurt somebody's feelings. It's very hard to give somebody a call and to say, I'm really sorry. A really good thing to do is send them shalach manos. Put them on your, like don't waste your list of shalach manos on your friends. It's like, send it to those, it's a way in which you reach out and say, do you know what? You're on my mailing, it's like you're on my mailing list. It's like, you're in my world. It's like, so, they're gonna think I'm such an idiot for sending them shalach manos. They never do. I sent them. And what's the dynamic? They sent me, but I didn't send them. Next year, what are they going to do? They're going to have to put you... And then what you do is shalach manos spreads goodness. It's like it's this easy way to spread kindness among people. And it has nothing to do with the poor. So often, we remember our collective responsibility when you're hungry. But that's not the way you build a community. You build a community by being there in everyday life and in good times and in bad times. The core ritual of Purim is Jews taking a holiday, and you remember this notion that every holiday is a speed bump for an idea. Every holiday carries an idea. And we try to make these ideas part of the Jewish vocabulary through these various rituals. Purim is the moment in which we recognize that the way we survive in history, that history is going to be filled with anti-Semites, history is going to be filled with evil. Jewish society survives by us willing to die for each other, for when one Jew is in trouble, life stops. Life stops. We don't say life continues. Life stops, and we do everything in our power, no matter what it is, to help to change that destiny. And each one of us sees whatever privilege we have as that which we must bring to bear to help our people. This is the Mordechai Esther story. This is the Mordechai Esther story. And when you look in the story itself, besides the word Haman, do you know what word is mentioned more than any other? Ha-Yehudim. The Jews. It's like over and again. It's Mordechai, what is he known as? Mordechai ha-Yehudi, because he's a Jew. Lashmidat ha-Yehudim. Yesh Amacha, there's one people who has dispersed, etc., to destroy the Jews. The Jews will be saved. Bring the Jews together. Mordechai the Jew. And Mordechai the Jew. And then they say to Haman, and if you're fighting the Jews, now this story is a story of somebody who picked a fight with our people. And our people responded not by each one trying to save themselves, but each one of us taking responsibility for each other. And through that, we survive. And what's so interesting is that this is it's in many ways, it's the antithesis of the Pesach story, and it's the antithesis of most of our holidays. Our holidays are holidays of look what God did for us. Look what God did for us. Now, it's not by accident that God is not mentioned here. It's not an omission that God's not mentioned here. It's besides the point. It's a different idea. We have the holiday of God saving us. That's Pesach. To turn Purim into Pesach is to create, it's like we don't need it. Purim doesn't need to be Pesach. Purim doesn't need to be Hanukkah. We don't need another Alanisim. We don't need to enumerate again the miracles of God. We got that. We have holidays for that. Purim is meant to do something completely different. It's supposed to tell us that, and this, by the way, it's been an interesting feature because the God of Judaism never created the passivity amongst Jews to do what we need to do in order to survive. In other words, this notion of Pesach could create the passive Jew. Pesach could listen. And in many ways, the Pesach story is what created the ideology of the ultra-Orthodox community, where we are going to wait for God to redeem us, and until then, we just have to hold our breath as much as possible. Unfortunately, the gas chambers was too long, we couldn't. But that's our response. What do we need to do? We're waiting. Faith could create a passivity, a moment of waiting, for God to be the one who redeems you, especially when Passover is the paradigm. But in many ways, Purim became even more than Passover, the paradigm of the way Jews responded in times of difficulty. Oh, we prayed, but if there was anything that we could ever do, we did it. Now, what could we do in diaspora life? What was available to us? Fighting wasn't available. What was available to us? Court Jews. That's it. Well, our assets. What are our assets? If in one generation our asset is a beautiful woman, we're using it. Throughout Spain, is it this person who was excellent in finance? Is it Teddy Roosevelt's tailor? Whoever it is, we Jews knew our assets, it wasn't overt force because we didn't have access to that. What do we need to do to help ourselves? Because this notion of God helps those who help themselves, which ultimately becomes the ideology of the Zionist movement, is found, the only holiday we have which personifies that is the holiday of Purim. Now, one of the interesting things, and with this I'll conclude, is what our tradition does afterwards with this story. Now, one of the things that we know it does is it deifies it. It puts God into the story. It says, how could God be missing? Well, I'll show you where God is in the story. Not knowing sometimes that when you think you're fixing it, you're actually ruining it. You think you're adding more faith. Part of it, we're not only living in a world of God's miracles, we have to live in a world in which there's Hamans and Achashverosh's. And the reality is that in every generation there are Hamans and Achashverosh's. And unlike Amalek, we all say that Haman is a descendant of Amalek. What does the Bible say about Amalek? Who's Amalek's enemy in the Bible? God. The Hamal Lashem Amalek, we don't know. I, God, will fight Amalek for you. Unfortunately, God's not fighting the Amaleks of history. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the Hamans. We're stuck with these people. And God's not going to save you. What are you going to do? And it's when you have a Mordechai and an Esther who are willing to endanger their lives that we have a chance. Now, in a beautiful rabbinic statement, they say as follows. And this is in the handout that you have here. They stood under the mountain. Rabbi Abdimi, son of Chama, son of Chassa, says, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain of Sinai upon them like an inverted cask, and said to them, if you accept the Torah, that will be well, and if not, here shall be your burial. Basically, what are the rabbis, how do they describe the experience of the desert? When God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, when God gave that Torah, in the midst of all the miracles of Egypt and of the desert, there was basically no free choice. God is basically saying, I'm giving you a Torah. Do you think the Jewish people could have? Jews didn't choose to be Jewish in the Bible. If you don't choose Judaism in the Bible, what happens to you? You die. At least that's in theory. Afterwards, it doesn't happen exactly that way, but in theory, this is your choice. Your choice is between life and death. It's not, be Jewish because it makes your life fulfilling. Be Jewish because if you don't, I'll kill you. That's basically the story. So when the rabbis look at the experience of giving the Torah at Sinai, that is God coercing the Jewish people, lifting the mountain above them and saying, I'm giving you the Torah, either accept it or here I will bury you. And even though that story doesn't happen, that's the experience. The Jewish people had no ability to choose, and every single time they tried to deviate, they encountered death. And what's interesting is how much they deviated even though they kept on encountering death, which is an interesting paradox, that somehow, that even with all the threats and all the punishment, God wasn't able to get the people. In other words, the threat of death wasn't strong enough. But that was the language. And the rabbis say, okay, in the Bible, God threatened us. So they say, if this is true, this furnishes a strong protest against the Torah. We don't have to keep the Torah then. If the reason why we kept the Torah is because God coerced us, nobody's responsible to keep something that someone else coerced you to do. We are only legally responsible to keep the Torah if we accept it. If God coerces us, then we're free, basically, from the requirement to observe the law, because there was never a moment of free choice. But Rava says, yet even so, they re-accepted it in the days of Achashverosh. We re-accept Torah in the days of Achashverosh because it says the Jews confirmed and took upon them. That's the verse we just read. But the verse that we just read is the Jews confirmed and took upon themselves what? To keep Purim. They didn't take all of Torah. What are the rabbis doing here? There are two possibilities. One, a more literal one, and one might be more of a slight stretch. When we Jews, one of the interesting things that the Jewish tradition did to this holiday of Purim is that we put God into the story. We say the miracles that God performed. We thank God for saving us. If we put God into a story in which God is not present, that is the antidote or the opposite of the desert experience in which God is trying to stuff God's divinity down our throat, and we are basically choking on it and saying to God, no. That's what happened. Now, the desert is God trying to stuff God's self down our throats, and the Jewish people are literally choking on it. They either vomit it out or die. Very few of them actually accept it. Here, there is no God. And if at a moment when there is no God, we choose to put God into the story, that is in fact the moment when the Jewish people are saying, we want to be Jewish. This is, in other words, diaspora Jewish life, when God is hidden, is when the Jewish people are now saying, we, of our own free will, we don't need, God's not here, but we're putting God in the story. This is when we fulfill our side of the covenant. And it's interesting. This is in fact what took place in Jewish history. When did Jews become Jewish? Precisely when God stopped pushing. And we said, God, we can't live without you at the story. We want you in the story. Even when you're not in the story, is when we began to take responsibility for our side of the covenant. There is no covenant in the Bible. I don't believe the Bible is a covenantal story. It's not a covenantal story. The covenant, if God wants that covenant, but you don't have, with the exception of a verse or there, a counter-covenant experience. You have a people being coerced, and covenant is not coercion. The covenant comes to life precisely when God leaves the story. And the paradigm for that is the story of Purim. The other side is that it's possible that it's not simply that we're bringing God back into the story. It's not that. But that we are accepting our side of Torah, our side of the covenant, not merely through an act of faith, but we are accepting our side of the covenant when we take our responsibility both to fellow Jews and to be a people. Our side of the covenant is when we say this word that repeats itself over and over again, Ha-Yehudim, the Jews. When we say we are part of the Jews, we're part of that Jews. It's not a faith commitment. It doesn't go exclusively through God. It goes also through your connection to our people. And in fact, this is the deep complexity and inner contradiction of our religion called Judaism. On the one hand, it is a religion and a system of faith which relates to God. But you do not understand Judaism if all you think it is a religion that goes via God. Wrong. You have the wrong religion. If it's not that God doesn't have a place, but if God is the only central figure through which you embrace Judaism, you're not going to be able to make sense of this tradition. You're not going to understand what we're doing. Jews have a bond to our people. Even God has a bond to our people, independent of their relationship to God. This whole notion that a person can't leave, this balance between religion and peoplehood, is an inner paradox and tension that accompanies our tradition for the last from its inception. In many ways, from its inception. The fact that the Jewish people worship idols, but God doesn't leave them, and that it comes back again, and the notion that Israel, even though they sin, are still an Israelite. The idea of this, this convert this woman who converts to become an Anglican. I told you about, she converts to be an Anglican, and she comes to the Supreme Court of Jerusalem, to the ultra-Orthodox Rabbi Waldenberg, and asks to please, she says, I made a mistake, I became an Anglican because my husband wanted me to convert. I realized I made a mistake, I want to rejoin. Could you please convert me back to Judaism? And Rabbi Waldenberg turns her down. He refuses to reconvert her back to Judaism, and he offers the following answer. He says, I can't reconvert you back because you never left. Because you never left. You can't leave. I don't care what you believe. He says a relationship of a Jew to his tradition is like the relationship of a child to their mother. You can't stop being someone's child. You can't stop being a Jew. And Purim, I would say, this last notion is either. You could see it that we are reclaiming the covenant by putting God into the story, which is what the tradition ultimately does, or in the language of the story itself, we're reclaiming our side of the covenant by saying this people is my people. And we're creating a certain moral standard of how we respond to the needs of that people and how we conduct ourselves as Jews in the midst of this people.